Faulty pattern recognition. God, this is something which is probably so impossible to try and contain in terms of everything that I've discussed. But what I'm going to try and do is lay out what I think faulty pattern recognition is, kind of go into the source of it, and then how you can correct it. So firstly, since like the beginning of time, literally with the Greeks and maybe even earlier with the Hebrews, I think people have been wrestling with the idea of trying to figure out what the pattern of existence is. And you've probably seen those flower patterns and all this stuff, that underlying fabric or structure of the universe. And so the Greeks called it logic, and maybe the Hebrews, the early Israelites, these early religions even further beyond them, they called things truth or what's visible. And I think that at the bedrock, taking into consideration all my other videos, we live in a universe that's separated into three categories. You've got the core reality, that's just the universal laws, Spinoza's God, God in existence, the fabric of reality. And you've got biological reality, which is us, messy, convoluted, chaotic, all over the place, lives in pure defiance of the physical, law-based universe, Spinoza's God. And then there's the third reality, which is constructed reality. So biblical texts, the Quran, the Judeo texts, the Buddhist texts, philosophies, even law structures and parliaments and all this stuff. That's a constructed reality. It's that best mediation between our biological reality and the core reality so that we can get along with it. At least that's the theory. And so faulty pattern recognition sounds simple in, I just need to learn how to see the world properly, but by our very nature as biological beings, we don't see the full spectrum of light, we don't hear the full auditory spectrum of sound, we don't even sense the full range of particles in the air, like dolphins can feel sonar waves and all this stuff. So we have a limited cone or a perspective of perceiving reality. And so faulty pattern recognition is something really tied into that very core foundation of our faulty experience in a way. And so the way it manifests really, I think, is by a primary driven factor, and that is ignoring sensory information and being impatient with sensory information that doesn't exist yet. So I'll explain what I mean. Say I'm going through life and I'm walking through a woods and it's daytime and everything is clear to my vision. When I'm seeing that woods, I'm seeing all of the physical manifestations of that woods. But if I'm walking through that woods and I see something perhaps that reminds me of something 10 years ago, I might be more motivated either to stare at that thing or not want to look at that thing. And that's because we as humans have emotions, and so I call that emol. And this is emotional logic, which is where we're confronted with sensory input, a wave of sensory information, but our emotions tangle up in that sensory information so that we either want to see more of it or less of it. And that scales. So, for example, you might have a bad experience with someone 5 years ago that has a certain physical appearance or has a certain archetype to them, and then if you meet someone like them again 10 years down the line, you might be really likely just to dislike that person from the get-go. And that's the emotional side of our pattern recognition coming in. That's us having a memory, a recall of something that we have taken as significant, an attributed meaning or a symbol to, and then anything that represents itself as that, we have some form of bias towards. And that's obviously, that's bad, right? Because if you're in a universe which is essentially all facts, and there's lots of emotions going on about certain things, then quite quickly you can get muddled up in a vortex of faulty pattern recognition because of it. You might want to avoid certain topics because you feel like those are bad in some way or that those impact you negatively. And then what that does is leaves out maybe a component of reality that when integrated can serve you quite well. And so biological life has this emotionality to it. It has drives, it has fears, wants, desires, wishes, all this stuff that convolutes the absolute in a very weird way. And when you've, say, got psychoses, schizophrenia, that way is often, I would think, a deviation from the usual line or core experience of other people. So when you've got a trusting home environment, or even when you've just lived a life where there's no reason to distrust, because we know that the amygdala, a part of the brain responsible for fear and fight and flight, those sort of regions, that limbic system regions, its default position is to trust. So if you raise a puppy and you're always good to that puppy's default position is just to trust. It's going to run over to lots of people and it's going to be perfectly happy. But the moment someone hits that dog or makes a loud noise, maybe pops a balloon or something, now that nervous system's been taught to distrust, right? And so now maybe the puppy doesn't want to go near balloons, especially in those formative years, or maybe it doesn't like certain stimuli. This is, in a sense, the attachment of something distrustful. And so when you've got these psychotic experiences, these schizophrenic experiences, there is an attachment, in my opinion, to something negative that in a way spirals out of control. Fear is just as much of an emotional motivator as love, right? And the thing about, say, euphoric experiences or loving experiences, well, we all know love is blind, for one example, and how much trouble that can get us into. So these definitely parallel. But fear is also something which is an emotional motivation. We might not want to listen to certain stimuli because we're afraid of something about that stimuli. And so that can create loads of different patterns and loads of different ways of thinking. From my experience, what I noticed is that when I was about 18, so the dawn of all my experiences, I noticed a fearful moment in Reduced to a Song, Tiny Little Robots by Cage the Elephant. They designed your life, you can join us on the other side, that song. And that triggered off a primordial fear in me. I think, a fear that's been around since the beginning of the evolution of species. And that fear, whenever I paid attention to the pattern of most of my deviation in thinking, it was the fear that was behind most of that pattern thinking. Or also, say that you're feeling isolated or alone, you might be tempted to ignore certain information in favor of other information, so signs of company or signs in media or signs in films to satiate that underlying system. And so as human beings, I feel like neuroses for us manifests as a very complex set of structures in terms of the mind. So a puppy, once it's distrustful of a balloon, just doesn't like to go near balloons. But if you take it home, it'll be perfectly happy just to be at home and it won't think about much. But because humans have the capacity for thought, negative experiences for us ruminate them, we ruminate on them and they turn into all kinds of manifestations. And so this is kind of the idea of being confronted with death for the first time. If you were a child and you were just told that people go to heaven, you'd never really confronted the idea of death or the fragility of life. When you do get into your early 18s, 20s, then you're confronted with something. Maybe you see something online, maybe you see something on the news, or maybe even worse in your personal life, and then that fractures something. Something's broken now. Maybe you're more considerate of death and what's in the afterlife, and that can confront you in a deep way. That's highly generative in both senses. It's highly generative to approach and integrate that stuff, but it's also highly generative in a bad way to avoid that stuff. Everything you avoid just generates in a different direction. And I like to think of it like this. So I drew like a little diagram once, but there's a circle in the middle, and that's us. That's our position in time. And then something happens, and we can choose to confront it, move forwards, or we can choose to run away from it, move backwards. When we run away from stimuli or run away from something that we're scared of, our brains generate lots of different thoughts to compensate for that thing we're afraid of. Whereas when we integrate it, things will rise up. Oh, but what if I don't live forever? What happens when I die? All this stuff. instead of integrating it and maybe just bolstering your nervous system, because your brain can teach your nervous system like a puppy. So if you come up with a concept like death, which is a really difficult one to grasp, but it's probably at the core of most of our psychoses, most people will just, oh, don't be silly, I shouldn't be afraid of that. But would you treat a puppy like that? Would you just grab the balloon and be like, don't be silly, don't be afraid of this balloon? It's like, no. You would carefully walk it through and say, okay, nothing to be afraid of, this is fine, and then introduce the stimuli slowly. Like, okay, well, I'm going to think about this concept for like 5-10 minutes, but then I'm going to go back and I'm going to think about that concept when I've got more space for it, say in like 10 days or something, and set some time to introduce yourself to that concept slowly. It doesn't all have to be done at once, because what you're trying to do is coach your nervous system through so that it feels more safe with that concept. Most people who have had very good upbringings or very good childhood environments, they're naturally, I would say, resilient to these sorts of experiences. It doesn't impact them as much as people that have had, say, fragile childhood experiences. A good example of this is that in conditions like schizophrenia, there is a genetic overlap and genes responsible for the programming of resilience, coding for resilience. And what they found in some studies is that in childhood development environments where children are fostered with more encouragement, community, and safe parenting figures, those resilient genes actually buffer, so the children end up more resilient and they end up stronger emotionally. And that's that nervous system feeling safe, so that even because it feels safe, it can wrestle with concepts which are quite difficult. And so the way that you correct faulty pattern recognition is you check for emotionality. When you are watching something, when you are experiencing something, or when you are thinking up something, you have to ask yourself, how am I feeling? If you're in a place of fear, you should abandon all thought, because it just grows in size, and then you should make yourself feel comfortable and then approach the concept. It feels incredibly, and this is another thing, this is one of the things that's good to think about psychosis. Psychosis is effectively an impatience with reality. That's an exceptionally good and clear way of thinking of it. Instead of being patient and waiting for your nervous system to calibrate, or your ideas about a scary concept to flourish, maybe by reading, listening to good people on the subject, or even just exploring the topic for yourself, you become impatient and you want to answer it now to calm down that nervous system. The problem is that immediacy is what creates the faulty patterns, and the more that happens, the more faulty patterns grow, and before long you rely on those faulty patterns for comfort instead of a process. So faulty pattern recognition, what I'm trying to say from the beginning here, is that we truly don't know fully what is the best augmentation of logic for our minds. We don't have a strict calculation for our perceptual systems. And because we don't have that, we just have to make sure that we give ourselves the best edge possible to figure things out and learn the truth from others and be taught effectively. And to do that, you have to make sure you're acting with patience. You have to make sure that you are acting in a safe nervous system, so unemotionally, effectively, calm, right? Not purely unemotional, apathetic, but in a calm environment and a calm space. Sometimes you need to just leave everything alone. So you need to leave politics alone, you need to leave complicated situations alone, you need to just focus on good friends, good living, and a good environment. And in that way, you might be able to gain enough trust back to that nervous system, treating it like a small puppy, so that then you can reconfront issues when you have the space for them. It's pointless just to try and run into all of these very extreme concepts, which many a time these things exist. All of these questions that your brain can ask are valid questions that can have answers or need answers, but you have to do it in the right way. Otherwise it breeds delusions and faulty pattern recognition and all this stuff. If you're motivated to try and silence an emotion, you'll see anything that you need in the environment to satisfy that emotion. If you are feeling angry, you'll see more angry patterns. If you're feeling sad, you'll see more sad patterns. This is called motivational bias. Motivational bias is that we see more of what we're experiencing and already believe. And so you have to make sure that you're in the right frame of mind before you start building your thoughts. I hope that explained it. Obviously, I'm going to bring out like a course on this in the future where I'm actually going to detail in a PDF all of the complexity and then maybe make a video to summarize what I say and just give all that out for free. So